Okay, welcome again, everyone. In today's webinar, we will be looking at Latin America's healthcare ecosystem. And first of all, big disclaimer, this webinar is going to be recorded and later available on social media platforms. If you're not comfortable with your name showing up on the recording, well, in case you do a question, please refrain from doing the question, and you can reach us later through our emails. If you do have a question during the webinar, please use the Q&A box and we will try to address as many of them as possible. And with that said, my name is Raul Adler from the Latin American Chamber of Commerce. And today we're very excited about this webinar. First, the Latin American Chamber of Commerce is a non-for-profit organization that represents the interests of the private sector. We help companies from Latin America who want to expand to Southeast Asia and companies from this region who want to enter or explore the Latin American markets. So first, a little bit of context about Latin America compared to Southeast Asia. For example, in terms of demographics, they are surprisingly similar. Latin America has a population of 660 million, while Southeast Asia has 685 million. The average age is 31 years in Latin America, while in Southeast Asia is 30 years. And life expectancy is 75 years in Latin America. And in Southeast Asia, it varies a lot depending on the country, but the average is the same, 75 years. So we have a lot of similarities in the two regions, but despite of that, we are basically at the other side of the world, which this huge distance makes one of the biggest challenges when doing business between the two regions. So many companies have the question often, so if it is not a huge market like North America, why should I go to Latin America? And there are mainly two big reasons for this. The first one is that Latin America is already a big market. It's not as developed, of course, as North America, but it's growing fast, and it has the potential of becoming a super big, important market. And the second and most important reason is that we have seen in the last years that disruptions in supply chain can happen all the time and from unthinkable reasons, from COVID to tariffs, geopolitics, or just even if it's a single ship blocking a canal, can cause huge disruptions. So we have seen that many industries and many companies are shifting from a supply chain that is focused on efficiency to a supply chain that is more focused on reliability and robustness. So just as an example that illustrates this, today we were talking with a rather large Indonesian company which has operations in Brazil, and they were telling us that they had before all their assets just on time for everything. And over the last years, they had to change this strategy completely, and now they prefer to have them just in case ready. So it's this shift that makes diversification a super important strategy. And of course, Latin America is one of the, I would say, most relevant places to diversify as a Southeast Asian company. Because of this, we have seen a very large increase in the exchange in many industries between Southeast Asia and Latin America. We have seen a huge increase in, for example, agriculture, mining, energy. However, and this is why this webinar is so important, the healthcare sector hasn't seen this increase relative to these other sectors. So healthcare still has all this opportunity gap. It hasn't increased as much as other industries. And of course, Latin America has a very strong influence from China, Japan, and Korea in this industry. But Southeast Asia hasn't seen this push as these other industries have. So that's why for us today is very important to show you this ecosystem in Latin America, to show you the opportunities that are there, and hopefully give you also the tools that you need to assess and maybe take the decision to to try Latin America at some point. So with that, I want to give the word to Alvin, which is from TechBruce, which are the co-organizers of this webinar. Thank you very much, Alvin, for being with us today. And I pass the microphone to you.
Hi everyone. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever we are joining us from. So thank you for joining us today again. I'm Alvin and I co-run TechBruce. So for those who are new to TechBruce, we are an open, inclusive, global community for founders, innovators, and professionals across health tech, biotech, and life science. We actually started in Singapore as casual weekly meetups, and today we are in multiple cities around the world. Singapore, San Francisco, Los Angeles, London, Edinburgh, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Bangalore, Mumbai, Sri Lanka, Dubai, as well as Johannesburg, South Africa. So we are a growing community of about 2,000 members across our WhatsApp groups and LinkedIn. We run a mix of things from casual coffee meetups to founders fireside chat, investor panels, startup pitch nights, both virtual and in person, as well as webinar like this to actually share more and exchange information. But at its core, TechBoost is really about creating a welcoming space where everyone can exchange ideas, build meaningful relationships, and collaborate across borders. So if you ever find yourself in any one of our cities, do feel free to join us and we will love to see you there. So now, without further ado, let me introduce our two guest speakers. Wow, one of them joining us at 4 a.m. and another one joining us at 6 a.m. This will be great. So first we have Guillaume. Guillaume is the founder and CEO of Global Health Intelligence, a leading provider of market intelligence solutions for the global healthcare industry. With over 25 years of experience in business consulting and in Latin America, Guillaume has become a recognized expert in helping healthcare and life science companies accelerate their growth strategies in emerging markets. And our second speaker, we have Jorge, who is an international program management leader at Forefront Medical Technologies in Singapore. He has 12 plus years of experience in medical device operation and manufacturing, leading cross-border execution and scales up across Asia and Latin America. In his free time, Jorge is a passionate scuba diver. I'm a scuba diver too. So anyway, they will be taking us through the Latin America healthcare market, bringing a lot of deep experience and on-the-ground insights from the region. So let me pass over my time to Guillaume to get us started. Guillaume, over to you.
Great, thank you, Alvin. Thank you for the kind introduction, the kind words. Before we move forward, just letting everyone know, here are our profiles and direct emails. So if anyone in this webinar has any questions or follow-up following the webinar, please feel free to reach out. Jorge, myself, and the rest of the team are very responsive. So again, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the futures of healthcare in Latin America. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Good morning to all the early risers in the Americas, and good evening for those of us joining from Asia. And before we begin, also a very big thank you to both LatAmCham for organizing this and for TechBruce. You've been excellent partners in putting this webinar together. Thank you also, Jorge, for your expertise in being here. Today, we're going to talk about the futures of healthcare in Latin America, and this is a region that I'm particularly passionate about. I spent most of my professional career in the region, and specifically in healthcare, because I just find it so fascinating. But the first question we can ask ourselves is, why are we talking about the futures of healthcare, not just the future? And the reality is that that healthcare is a pluralistic state, right? My reality, looking at this from Miami or from within the region, is very different than that of someone in Mexico or Brazil or Colombia. And your reality is also different from that of your neighbor. So we have to look at healthcare from a pluralistic state and really understand these different components and these different angles that are a mosaic of what's going on in the region. And since we cannot count on a single reality, we really need to understand the multiple points of view in terms to really get us to where we want to be, in terms to understand what our products are, where they fit, where they can go, and how can we capitalize on the market dynamics that Raul explained to us earlier on. And so, as a philosophy teacher once told me, Guillaume, the reality is in all of this is that we think with our feet. As humans, we don't think with our brains, we think with our feet, because it all depends on where we are positioned and where we are standing. So with this, Jorge and I will try to shed some light on our experience in the region, what we think, and really try to maybe just increase our overall communal knowledge and share with you some insights. And by all means, please feel free to share your questions in the Q&A box as Raul had mentioned, and feel free to contact us again in the future if you want to follow up. So we're going to start here with the challenges and the realities of different elements in Latin America. So when we talk to manufacturers and distributors of medical devices and medical equipment within the region, we've identified these 7 main areas as key challenges when dealing with their products in the region. From a product standpoint, whether it's product registration or imports or sometimes product recalls, that's a reality that manufacturers and distributors are constantly facing. Another big challenge is in regards to sales and purchasing. So everything from tenders, government tenders, which represent probably around 50 to 60% of sales in the region, down to the changes in tenders. We see that Mexico right now, there's a big shift going from 1-year government tenders to 2-year government tenders, so increasing the importance of sales within the public sector. Group purchasing organizations, GPOs, consolidated purchasing is a key trend that we're seeing also. The rise of integrators, and now then the downfall of integrators within the Mexican public system. Pricing is an element here, and vertical integration also of the healthcare systems, notably in countries like Brazil. Vertical integration, a big factor there. Another big challenge, distribution. Distribution, when most of the products in Latin America are imported to very few countries, notably Brazil, Costa Rica, Argentina have local manufacturing, Mexico as well, but mostly for export manufacturing that has to re-import. So distribution from the import standpoint, the regulatory standpoint, logistics, considering a region where about 20% of the population lives in rural areas and is very difficult to access, right? So how do we get that logistics going? Countries like Brazil, which are very complex, Raul, Alvin, you guys live in Southeast Asia, you can feel the differences, right, when it comes to dealing from an urban setting to a rural setting and what it implies for distribution. Product usage, everything from dealing with the key opinion leaders, with the medical staff, the doctors, the physicians, dealing with their workload and how they're using the products from trainings and so on. Financial standpoint, whether that's actually selling the product, right, getting it into a user's hands, but then all collecting from that government or from that institution, from that regulatory body, whatever it might be. Payment terms, which are changing regularly, managing FX rates, inflation in an emerging market is challenging. Regulatory standpoint, we see political changes, we see product registration, taxes. In a country like Brazil, there's up to 70 local taxes. And that goes without saying, then we go into the competitive setting of new entrants, of established players, and the overall competitive landscape. So those are some of the main challenges that we see our clients and our colleagues dealing with across the region. Certainly, this is just food for thought. We're not going to cover all of these topics here today, but if you have any questions on these specific topics, we'd be happy to discuss them with you at a later stage. One thing is for sure within all of this is that the markets we deal with are in perpetual and constant change. And that's also part of the reality we have to deal with. Every single challenge that I mentioned a moment ago is changing and is different today than it will be in 3 years from now. So we have to learn to adapt, learn to deal with these challenges. So now let's go and talk about hospital infrastructure for all of this. Ro, you did a very good introduction, putting some comparisons and some contrasts between Southeast Asia and Latin America. Now we're going to delve into the hospital infrastructure of Latin America. Now, before we go into this, I just want to point out that most of the information that we'll be talking about in this section actually comes from our own proprietary databases, information that we collect ourselves for the region. And let me start off by saying that, generally speaking, across the world, on a global level, we're talking about 100,000 hospitals, which is a very round number. But here it is, 100,000 hospitals across the world, of which about 30% are in developed economies, namely the United States, Canada, Europe, Japan, Australia, Korea, amongst others, right? Developed economies. About 1/4 of the world's hospitals are in China alone. That's absolutely fascinating. 1/4 of the world's hospitals are in China alone. And slightly over 1/5 of the world's hospitals are in Latin America. So Latin America is home to approximately 20,000 hospitals. Now, if we make a list of the top 10 emerging markets by number of hospitals, we see that 4 of the top 10 are in Latin America, namely Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, and Argentina. So Latin America is really home to a vast infrastructure. Over 19,000 hospitals. We're talking about over 1 million hospital beds, over 50,000 operating rooms. But there are major differences between Latin America and its neighbors to the north, Canada and the United States, or even Europe, in terms of hospital and hospital infrastructure. The first major difference is in the average hospital size. The average hospital in Latin America has just over 50 beds, compared to about 160 in the United States or Europe. And so this causes major differences at the time of managing logistics, managing distribution, managing sales, but not just on the commercial aspect, also in terms of developing centers of expertise or the ability to acquire high-tech equipment. When we have hospitals that are much smaller in size, we have a much lower patient throughput. And with lower patient throughput, we see fewer cases and fewer complex cases, which inhibits the development of centers of expertise and of the acquisition of higher technology products and solutions. But it doesn't just happen on a regional basis. It's not all of Latin America that has an average of 52 beds. If we look at countries specifically on a granular level, for instance, Mexico, we will see that the average public hospital in Mexico has just under 100 beds, but the average private hospital in Mexico has only 15. So when you're looking to commercialize your products, we can't have a one-size solution for all of Latin America. It really depends on the country that you're looking at. It depends on the product you're looking at, the target market you're going after, and understanding that is really key to success. So I'm going to pause here for a second. And Jorge, I'd love to hear your thoughts because you have a lot of insight and a lot of wisdom to share with everyone here about the contrast and comparisons between Southeast Asia and Latin America.
Yeah, thank you, Guillaume. The point that Latin America has a smaller hospital connects directly to what I have seen in operations, actually. So whenever you have a more fragmented demand, it means that you're going to have smaller order sizes, which ends up relying dependently or heavily on your distributors, right? So you can have a higher quality device, but if your go-to-market strategy was initially planned for large consolidated hospitals like in the US or Europe, you might fail if you want to enter in Latin America. So let me give you 2 points here for comparison. The first one is on the regulatory side. For example, let's compare Mexico and Brazil. In Mexico, the regulatory entity is famously known for asking more extensive documentation, while in Brazil, they might rely more on local audits. So that's something that, depending on the country you want to enter, you need to distinguish your go-to-market strategy. The second point is that most people think that Latin America, everyone speaks Spanish, but one of the biggest markets, Brazil, they speak Portuguese, which then ends up linking that your labeling requirements have to be adapted to that language requirement in every country. So these are 2 points for comparison that connect directly to this fragmentation in the hospitals.
Jorge, that's a really good point, because we tend to look at Latin America as a single region, but the reality is that we're talking about 22 countries, right? 22 different legal entities in terms of governments and how they operate, and each one with their own structure. So it is highly complex. When we look at the region, we're talking, like I mentioned earlier, over 19,000 hospitals, but to Jorge's point, multiple countries within that. If we look at the segmentation and the focus, or where these hospitals are positioned, we see that about 80% are within 5 countries. 34% of the hospitals are in Brazil, followed by Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, and Chile. So these 5 countries represent 83% of the total installed base of hospitals across the region. And as Jorge mentioned, the differences between Brazil and Mexico are huge, and they're massive countries, right? So going and selling in these countries often requires distributors, and relying on distributors to access the market. Now, again, if we're looking at your products, it's important to understand the segmentation of the hospitals in terms of level of care. We see that across the region, 28% of institutions are primary care facilities, 57%, are general hospitals, and then the rest, 15%, are specialized hospitals for complex cases. So depending on your products, you really need to focus and target the institutions you're going after and your target clients. Simultaneously, or similarly, if we're looking at complex products for angiography systems or for MRIs, we see that our target market then reduces even further. Only 14% or 17% of institutions have these types of equipment. So again, that enables targeting and understanding the market dynamics. What we have seen over the years, though, analyzing hospital infrastructure and hospital data for the past 10 years, is that there's a direct correlation between the size of the institution and its ability to invest in technology and high-tech equipment. The smaller institution, it tends to be more of a general or primary care facility. The larger the institution by number of beds or number of operating rooms, tends to be more of a high specialty institution with the capabilities to invest in technology. Now, with that said, it's not just a question of money. There's an element of patient throughput, like we mentioned earlier. The bigger the institution, the more patients the institution is able to see, but also the physicians, the trained physicians that are seeing the cases, seeing the patients, and are able to relay that to more of the hospital infrastructure that has the infrastructure, the technology infrastructure and backbone to deal with those cases. So they're more used to dealing with high-tech equipment, absorbing it within their walls, and actually treating patients. Obviously, in addition to the financial component of larger hospitals, tend to have more of the capability to leverage their infrastructure and invest in high-tech equipment. Jorge, how does that compare to what you've seen both in the region, but also how does it contrast to Southeast Asia?
Yeah, I think here I want to pinpoint to what we could separate in the theoretical market size and what's going to be your real addressable market, right? Numbers don't lie, but you always have to partner with companies like Global Health Intelligence, right? Because what you can see in practice in Southeast Asia might have a one-to-one correlation, but Latin America, as you mentioned before, is quite fragmented, more than 20 countries and very diversified. So not every hospital is going to have, as you said, the infrastructure to adapt your technology. You need to understand things like what's the clinical profile, right? How often they adapt to new products, where are the products coming from, who is the key opinion leader of that hospital. So all these factors add up to that mix that any company who wants to enter in Latin America they need to consider in their addressable market.
Totally, very good. Yes, and the need to understand the local market, absolutely. And as you mentioned earlier, relying on good distributors, because they're the ones who are opening the market.
Mm-hmm.
Totally. So with that, in the intro, Alvin and Raul, you both mentioned the growing importance of Asian products in Latin America. And this is a fascinating slide. Over 95% of all medical devices and medical equipment sold in Latin America are imported. Okay. And so understanding where the products come from helps us understand the dynamics and how they're shifting. And what we see is during COVID, we see that that was the start of a considerable growth of both Chinese and Asian products within the Latin American market. In 2019, 22% of all medical devices, in terms of units, came from China. Last year, that had reached 33%. Massive growth, massive growth. Now, Asian products, Will, you're specifically talking about Asian products a minute ago, saw lower growth at the beginning, right? 8 to 10% to 12%. But last year in 2025, other Asian countries outside of China represented 18% of all the units imported into Latin America. So huge growth of both Asia and Chinese products in Latin America. And we see this historically was for lower cost products, lower cost, lower technology products. But we see that this has changed considerably in the past 2 years. We see companies, obviously like Mindray, a global player, well established in Latin America, but we see other players like United Medical Imaging, fascinating, huge technology, brilliant company, lower cost than established players, but certainly very present in Latin America. Another company, Microport, a Chinese company, dominates the world in terms of stents, market share in stents, very active, very present in Latin America, recently launched its robotic assisted surgery system in Brazil and is launching it in the rest of the region. So huge increase in terms of Asian players in the region with high growth and now moving away from low-cost products into much more sophisticated and high-tech solutions. But this variance across, or this look upon the region varies considerably by country. And we see considerable growth. The countries with the highest growth of Chinese and specifically Asian products are notably Colombia and Brazil. And you can see here their growth. Mexico has seen lower growth than its counterparts due to cultural proximity and free trade agreements that it has with the United States and other partners. And we see that actually, interestingly enough, Chile has remained relatively stable and actually kind of seen a fallback in terms of the units imported from Asia. So again, countries are very different, but certainly the mentality and the openness and willingness to work and understand Asian products has grown over the past years, and that's a tidal wave of change that we're seeing. Jorge, have you seen this in your experience?
Yeah, as a fact, I've been working in China, Southeast Asia since 2018. Right? So I have seen exactly this time frame firsthand, and I can see this growth in exports coming from China and other Southeast Asia countries into Latin America. Now, there are two sides of the story. One is mostly in Latin America, people feel that the Asian products might be consumables or low complexity, which translates into low cost. But as you're pinpointing here, we have seen an increase in higher quality, let's say class 2 or class 3 devices, which require higher technology and of course, more scrutiny in the regulatory aspect. So this perception relies on the gap that we see between, say, US or European brands and Latin America. Sometimes companies or the market in the US feel, in Latin America feel that the US brands are trusted and proven, while in Asia, they're cost effective, but they still think that the quality varies. So I can tell you, because I've worked in startups and in big tech manufacturing, that the capability that Asian countries have is not really the bottleneck. It really is how reliable or how robust your quality system is. Whenever companies wants to implement changes, say material changes to create your product more cost effective, that change might have a direct correlation in Latin America and how they perceive your new product or your new implemented product. So that's something to watch out and to also focus internally in companies that want to enter in Latin America.
Absolutely, Jorge. And I think to your point, I was recently in a conference with a group of clients and industry players, and one of them mentioned that they had started manufacturing in China, and their clients said, "Oh, finally, you're moving to Asia to lower your costs, but not just lower your costs, to increase your speed of innovation and product development." So, to your point, it's not just about reducing costs anymore, but it's also the understanding that a lot of good engineering comes out of Asia, and that increases speed to market and product iteration and innovation.
That's right.
So with that, we're going to talk a little bit about account targeting. So understanding who your clients are and how to get access to them. Just a quick note on artificial intelligence. Over the past 5 years, we've been seeing a massive influx and talk around AI, and specifically in terms of analyzing and crunching data. What I find fascinating is not just what AI tools can do today, but the speed at which the iterations are coming to market. Internally, and this is a side note, just talking about our own products for a second, we use AI. We've been using AI for 3 years on analyzing databases. And over those 3 years, we use 5 different iterations of large language models, simply because the next generation of LLM is so much greater and so much better than the previous version. So it's not even a linear change. It's an exponential change, even within the tools of AI, which I feel is probably one of the most fascinating subjects around. And this graph here illustrates just how AI systems have not just reached in many levels the cognitive abilities of human performance, but really surpassed them in many fronts. And what this translates to today in terms of understanding and analyzing markets is that while we used to work in one way, and that we had one tool in our toolbox, today we have 4, 5, 6, 7 tools at our fingertips, which means that we can develop market access, we can talk to clients, we can engage better, faster than we ever were. Now, granted, there's always going to be companies out there that like the traditional historic way of doing things, of operating, because they're set in their ways. That's perfectly fine. And to that, I'll just make a quick analogy comparing, the speed of development of market tools, whether it's for product development or market access, to Formula One. If you're a fan of Formula One, and you love your team, right, and they're doing great, and they decide, okay, well, I'm going to stay exactly where I am with the current pilot, the current engine, and the current design of my vehicle, right? How long will it take for that exact team to be out of the race? Will it be 1 year? Maybe the next year they're still able to compete because they have the best driver and the best engine and the best car. 2 years? I doubt it. 3 years, they're guaranteed to be out. So this is a quick analogy to say that, using these tools is just so critical and so important in order to develop markets, gain market access, and really come out. So with that, I'm going to leave you with just a few thoughts on how to win in these markets. Consider a spirit of collaboration, like Jorge mentioned, working with your distributors, working with the people on the market, faster innovation, faster innovation mindset to iterate on products. Understand the tech profiles of your clients, of the hospitals within Latin America. Okay, have active initiatives with your distributors and with the people that work with you in Latin America. It's going to be critical to propose ideas, to work with them, to listen to them also, and to explore new avenues, because there is certainly a hunger for and an appetite to explore new ways of working. So with that, we're going to conclude our presentation and really open up the floor to the Q&A. If you have any questions, we have a moderator here, Alvin Raul. I think you've been looking at the Q&A chat. Please let us know. What is the audience thinking? What are some of the questions coming through?
Yes, there are indeed two questions. One, let's start with the second one because it's more on the administrative side. If the slide deck is going to be available.
Absolutely. The slide deck and the video recording are both going to be available afterwards.
Yes. And the first question actually was, what are the most vital pain points for Latin American hospitals?
Very good question. So I think that depends considerably by country and has to do a little bit with market access, right? So for instance, in Chile, the regulatory entity is actually very flexible, and starting to sell products is a lot faster and a lot easier to do in Chile than it is in other markets like Brazil or Mexico. However, Chile only has about 400 hospitals compared to about 6,500 in Brazil and about 3,200 in Mexico and about 2,000 in Colombia and Argentina. So, I think first is about where do you start with your products? Like, where do you get them first? Now, within each market, there are different constraints and different dynamics. So, for instance, Chile tends to be a much more sophisticated market, a larger hospital size, over 100 beds per hospital, so greater technology per institution. In other markets like Mexico, or even tertiary markets like, I see Paraguay, Uruguay, Bolivia, Peru, it's really about understanding the primary care facilities, right? And giving access to hospitals and to healthcare for a majority of the population. There are certainly elite hospitals within all of these countries, but probably not as many as in a country like Brazil or Mexico, where you have large institutions like Albert Einstein, Sírio-Libanês, Médica Sur, amongst others, which are really the top of the top. Within all of this, I do think that financial constraints are an issue across the board for many institutions, many hospitals. There is a vertical integration, like we mentioned at the beginning, of hospital and healthcare systems in Brazil, which means that much more larger groups are owning hospitals, from insurance companies owning down to the facilities and clinics, which is changing the dynamics. We haven't seen that pace of change in other countries like Mexico. Like Mexico is still somewhat fragmented. There are groups, but there's a handful. There's maybe 17, and they're not necessarily vertically integrated like they are in Brazil. So that's a very long-winded answer to the question. Certainly, there's many more angles to explore within that, and happy to engage with the audience member here who had that question by email or by phone at a later date.
Thank you, Guillaume. Alvin, do you want to take the next question?
Yeah. Thank you, Guillaume. Thank you, Hori. Actually, I have a I have a question, PM to me for Hori. What's the most underrated advantage of setting up manufacturing in Latin America?
Yeah, I would say it's the operational agility. In Latin America, when I was working exclusively here, I can see that people here are closer to the product, even though it might be only a manufacturing hub. They're more hands-on on understanding what's the end use of the product, which means that whenever you are ramping up and conditions are constantly changing, this is really a key skill to have, because decisions can be made early on. Let's say your headquarters are based in Asia, your manufacturing facility is in Costa Rica, Mexico, Brazil. So you're working pretty much around the clock, right? You're working almost 24/7, right? Because when your headquarters are sleeping, your manufacturing site is implementing those solutions. So this time zone alignment helps to move things faster. In the same time, if your headquarters are in the US, you also have that alignment during the day, right? So it depends on where you are going for the market. But I would say that speed of execution is what really gives Latin America an edge nowadays?
Thank you, Jorge. We have another question from Pablo Guerrero. Thank you very much, Pablo. When talking about digital health and the use of health data for research, is there an understanding where each country stands? How far is their digitalization, and what framework for data access or data sharing are pursued?
Jorge, do you want to take that, or do you want me to start?
You can start, Guillaume.
Thank you. I appreciate it. complex questions, right? I think so. Every country is different, but generally speaking, I would say that aside from a few exceptions, when it comes to overall patient data, comes from the public sectors of Latin America, because they are the consolidated way of accessing health. There's a big push in Mexico right now for a standardized electronic health record. And this has been in the talks for about 8 years and it's finally materializing. So it's very good, which will help increase access to healthcare data. We have to remember that across the region, approximately 70% of the care is given within the public institutions. So going after public institutions, while they may be lower technology or lower advancement or lower pay per procedure, they are the larger volume. So it makes sense that, accessing health data and health economics comes from the public sector first. In a few countries like Brazil, the private sector is highly ingrained and embedded within the public sector. And today, so there's cross procedures, right? So a procedure that's financed by the public sector but takes place in a private institution. That's fairly common in Brazil today, where the public healthcare could not live without the private healthcare, and the private healthcare could not survive without the public healthcare financing. And so here, in that case of Brazil, we are actually seeing a very good monitoring of patient data within both public and private, obviously at different levels, right, with different depths, but much more so than in many other countries in the region. It's still fairly recent in terms of accessing patient data. There are a lot of privacy laws in place. Those do vary by country, but there are strict privacy laws in place where we can't just access patient data, and it has to be anonymized and follow a whole series of protocols. But that gives you, I think, an overview of where we stand in terms of analyzing patient data.
If I may add to that, from my experience, what I have seen, once you have entered Latin America and you want to start digitalizing, right, to use this public data, this becomes a change management situation, right? And every single country will have different lead times. So changes that you want to implement, let's say in Mexico, they might ask for a 6-month period, while in Brazil, they might ask, let's say, 15 months, right? So then going backwards, this becomes a matter of how much your supply chain and how resilient your supply chain is, right? You might have to build up stock to cover for that time where the regulatory entities are evaluating your change.
Great point.
Thank you very much, Jorge.
I think we have time for just one more question.
Yeah.
Sure. There are a couple of questions, but I'll take the one question that came from Luke. Considering how fragmented the healthcare institutions are you seeing more community healthcare, for example, traveling nurses?
What I have seen is an interest on part of the global manufacturers, call them, the Philips of the world, for instance, to actually try to bring healthcare to patients, right? So having mobile units for diagnostics, right, for imaging diagnostics, amongst others, and access rural areas and bring the care to the patient. I've seen this as an initiative from global players, but also from local institutions a lot of local institutes, particularly I've seen one in Mexico for breast cancer, and going to communities and to do diagnoses for breast cancer early diagnostics, amongst others. So that is something that I have seen. I wouldn't say it's a generalized movement, but it is very present, and it is one way where I think innovation is coming from the region in terms of, we need to break the model of patient, physician, institution and think about how do we increase access overall to care, and thinking about the patient-centric element of that. And I think it's a very clever way to innovate.
Thank you very much, Guillaume.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. There are a couple more questions, but I'll just leave our emails again in the chat. If you want these questions to be answered, you can reach out via email to the speakers, and we will be happy to answer them. So with that, I want to thank again Guillaume and Jorge for being our speakers today. Of course, Alvin as a co-organizer, and of course, all the participants, all the listeners of the webinar for your time. Thank you very much. Have a good evening if you're in Asia. Have a good day if you're in Latin America, and hopefully we'll see you again in one of our next webinars. Thank you very much.